Hello dear students and viewers. Today we are going to discuss Indian English poetry and three poets in particular, Nissim Ezekiel, K Ramanujan and Jayanta Mahapatra. Indian English poetry can be broadly divided into three broad phases: imitative, assimilative and experimental if we go by chronology. The first phase, that is the imitative phase, is the initial stage, that is the late 19th and early 20th century, when the influence of Romantic and Victorian poets was palpable. The subjects of the Indian English poets were chiefly native, for instance, nature, dreams, but the style was remarkably foreign. These poets were seeking to make the Indian presence felt in English poetry across the world. We have examples from this phase in the poems of Torudutt, Michael Madhusudhan Dotto and Derozio. The next phase can be said to be the assimilative phase, which is the pre-independence period of India. The poetry of this period focuses on awakening the nationalist consciousness and highlights the vignettes of cultural identity which are exquisitely and exclusively Indian. The poets seek to define a poetic self as a strong independent voice, unlike the poems of the first phase where the poetic voice was not so eloquent and not so strong. Examples of the second phase are Sarojini Naidu and Rabindranath Tagore. The third phase can be said to be the experimental phase and actually happened in post-independence India. Post-independence Indian English poetry focused on the turmoil and the uncertainty of the times due to rapid urbanization and industrialization. This was a distinct new phase that severed connections from the Romantic past and was not written only to emphasize Indianness. The poetry of this period upholds the emergent new sensibility that is neither coyly imitative nor squarely descriptive of Indian images, but is aggressive and bold and does not shy away from self-expression. My dear students and viewers, the three poets we are going to discuss today belong to this third and most important phase of Indian English poetry. We are going to discuss Nissim Ezekiel's Night of the Scorpion, K Ramanujan's The River, and Jayanta Mahapatra's poem The Hunger today. Nissim Ezekiel was considered among the first of the Indian English modernist poets. He was born into the Bene Israeli community of Bombay, and his poems, more often than not, offer a social vision which presents the reader with glimpses of his urban experience and his experiences of belonging to a minority community. He was an extremely well-read man and a professor of English literature in one of the most important colleges of Bombay University. His poems provide glimpses into other aspects of Indian life, in spite of the fact that they deal with very private experiences and emphasize moments of intensity and passion. His attitude as a poet is that of an emotionally detached observer without any traces of sentimentality. My dear students, you can easily identify these traits with that of the major English modernist poets. Here we have his poem Night of the Scorpion. Let us read it. I remember the night my mother was stung by a scorpion. 10 hours of steady rain had driven him to crawl beneath a sack of rice. Parting with his poison flash of diabolic tail in the dark room, he risked the rain again. The peasants came like swarms of flies and buzzed the name of God 100 times to paralyze the evil one. With candles and with lanterns, throwing giant scorpion shadows on the mud-baked walls, they searched for him. He was not found. They clicked their tongues. With every movement that the scorpion made, his poison. He may stay still, they said. May the sins of your previous birth be burned away tonight, they said. May your suffering decrease the misfortunes of your next birth, they said. May the sum of all evil, balanced in this unreal world, against the sum of good, become diminished by your pain. May the poison purify your flesh of desire and your spirit of ambition, they said. And they sat around on the floor with my mother in the center, the peace of understanding on each face. More candles, more lanterns, more neighbors, more insects, and the endless rain. My mother twisted through and through, groaning on a mat. My father, skeptic, rationalist, trying every curse and blessing, powder, mixture, herb and hybrid. He even poured a little paraffin upon the bitten toe and put a match to it. I watched the flame feeding on my mother. I watched the holy man perform his rites to tame the poison. After 20 hours, it lost its sting. My mother only said, "Thank God the scorpion picked on me and spared my children." At one level, the poem can be understood as the responses to a scorpion stinging the poet's mother. At another level, it is a depiction of the Indian cultural ethos of care, compassion, and camaraderie, and the epitome of typical Indian motherhood that depicts self-abnegating love and sacrifice. Yet another interpretation is the enactment of an encounter between age-old religious faith and secular post-independence rationalism. The scorpion may also be symbolic of evil, and M.K. Naik agrees with the view, adding that the poem narrates the different kinds of attitude that are used to deal with evil. While the belief that the sins of one's previous birth can be burnt away with the suffering endured in the present birth adheres to the integral religious beliefs that are prevalent in India, and particularly the Hindu religion, the belief that every movement of the scorpion till it is discovered makes the poison spread faster in the mother's body is pure superstition. When religion fails in providing a cure, the skeptic rationalist father of the narrator is seen desperately experimenting with all kinds of medicine, herbal and otherwise, to save his wife. When modern science too has failed, they resort to magic, which is as ancient as the ancient religions, if not more. The magic doctor chants incantations to tame the poison and curb its strength, but in vain. The concluding lines showing the mother's expression of relief and gratitude that, and I quote, "The scorpion picked on me and spared my children," unquote, symbolize pure maternal love and devotion, the most ancient of all the contrasted responses presented before. The image of the mother which we find here is evoked in many of Ezekiel's other poems, such as Cows, Night of the Scorpion, and A Daughter's Illness. We next come to K Ramanujan. He said, and I quote, "In my adolescence, I rejected religion, caste, community. I think I learned effectively to live without them as well as anyone can. They are of interest to me because I know them in my bones. Though I have no religion, I can't resist temples, religious customs, their music and poetry." One of his favorite poetic strategies is ironic subversion, and it is found in most of his poems. Ramanujan wrote widely and across a number of genres, but among them, his poems are remembered as enigmatic works of an amazing originality, unique sophistication, and a rare artistry. Let us read his poem, A River. In Madurai, city of temples and poets, who sang of cities and temples, every summer a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand ribs, straw and women's hair clogging the water gates at the rusty bars, under the bridges with patches of repair all over them, the wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets only sang of the floods. He was there for a day when they had the floods. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by the water, rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda as usual. The new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman drowned. Perhaps twins in her, kicking at blank walls even before birth. He said the river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year, and then it carries away in the first half hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and 1 pregnant woman, expecting identical twins, with no moles on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart. The poet lays bare the general or macrocosmic human apathy of the poets in the microcosm of Madurai, the city of temples. The conventional image of a river is one of picturesque beauty and a source of life force to the fauna and flora around. However, Ramanujan totally inverts this hackneyed imagery of the river to suggest that the river can be a force that renders loss and destruction on the poor and the vulnerable. Along with the creation of this disturbing imagery of the river, the poet lashes out at the poets whose creativity is confined to walking the well-traversed path and singing only about the river when it floods, ignoring the human plight. Banal items like women's hair and straw clogging the water gates not only undercuts the starry-eyed imagery of the river created by other poets during the time of the floods, but it also upholds the everyday mundane reality of human life. Bridges with patches of repair all over them strengthens the ugliness and ordinariness of life all around. To further concretize the commonality of the river, Ramanujan brings in the imagery of 2 most unromantic animals, the crocodile and the buffalo. The creative impotence of the new poets to sing of human pain and suffering is hinted by the repetition of the flood's destruction. 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and 1 pregnant woman expecting identical twins. Next, let us come to Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry. He is important not just for his tone of ironic detachment that is found all over his poems, but also for bringing to the fore issues which were real but never considered appropriate for poetic idiom. A prolific author, Mahapatra uses images from the external world to express personal feelings, much like the American poets of the 1960s and 70s, such as Robert Bly. Let us read the poem Hunger. It was hard to believe the flesh was heavy on my back. The fisherman said, "Will you have her?" carelessly, trailing his nets and his nerves, as though his words sanctified the purpose with which he faced himself. I saw his white bone thrash his eyes. I followed him across the sprawling sands, my mind thumping in the flesh's sling. Hope lay perhaps in burning the house I lived in. Silence gripped my sleeves. His body clawed at the froth his old nets had only dragged up from the seas. In the flickering dark, his hut opened like a wound. The wind was I, and the days and nights before. Palm fronds scratched my skin. Inside the shack, an oil lamp played the hours bunched to those walls. Over and over, the sticky suit crossed the space of my mind. I heard him say, "My daughter, she's just turned 15. Feel her? I'll be back soon. Your bus leaves at 9. The sky fell on me, and a father's exhausted while, long and lean. Her ears were cold as rubber. She opened her wormy legs wide. I felt the hunger there. The other one, the fish slithering, turning inside." In his important book, Indian Writing in English, K R Srinivas Iyengar depicts Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry as being brutal in its precision of despair. No pseudo-romanticism shadows the poem that explores the informed child sex trade prevalent in society. The poem has the plot of a short story. There is one central theme, the impact of hunger that lies at the core. Apparently, the poem is based on a real-life event. The poet depicts 3 kinds of hunger here: the hunger for food, hunger for sex, and hunger for emotional satisfaction. In the lines, "I saw his white bone thrash his eyes," the conflict between the man's conscience and hunger is brilliantly captured by the poet. The eye seems to be reflecting the guilt, and the bones, which have become visible only because of the man's nearly rickety body, it counters his guilt, reminding him of the pangs of starvation. The narrator notices in the parting of the wormy legs of the girl's cold rubber-like body a hunger not for love or for lust, but for food, and in a bizarre mockery of the narrator's lust, the hunger for flesh dissipates. The fish image that we find in the last line of the poem is an old fertility symbol. I have used the term crossroads while describing the three poets that we discussed. The poets we have discussed today discerned a change from the traditional and the old world order to a new one, noting the good, bad, and ugly aspects of society, not being judgmental, but with an air of almost cynical indifference. In the three poems that we have read, The Night of the Scorpion, The River, and Hunger, we find an intense irony which runs as an undercurrent. The crossroad image has been invoked to stress on the uncertainty, on the doubt, and the frustrations faced by the poets who were desperate in breaking the shackles of tradition. We have at the crossroads three poets representative of modern India who are stricken on one side by the doubts and the pangs of guilt, and on other side by the promise of the future that lays in front. They were apprehensive how much modernity can be accommodated in the typical Indian mindset, since there were already indications that such a marriage of the past and present may only breed corruption, emotional sterility, and widespread depression. I hope, dear students and viewers, that this presentation will serve as the starting point for negotiations with these three poets and their poetry. Thank you very much.